There was a bowl on the counter before there was a bag on the shelf. 30 snacks. No box told her how to make them. No lab flavored them for her. Just butter, sugar, whatever the icebox had left, and 30 minutes of a Tuesday afternoon. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Every one of these disappeared the same decade. The snack aisle got longer. That is not a coincidence. That is not progress. That is a country that forgot how to feed itself in 20 minutes flat. Number 30. Homemade popcorn balls. The syrup went first. Corn syrup and sugar boiled down on the stovetop until it turned the color of a Sunday morning, thick enough to coat a spoon and stay there. Poured hot over a bowl of popped corn. Hands greased with butter so the sugar wouldn't take the skin off. Shaped fast before it set. Wrapped in wax paper, twisted at both ends like a piece of candy from a shop that never existed. Rural Midwest kitchens in the 1970s made these for county fairs and Halloween sacks, 10 cents a batch, a dozen balls from one pot. Nothing store-bought about it. Nothing that came from a machine. Number 29. Ants on a laga stalk of celery, split and drying slightly at the cut edge. Peanut butter dragged down the groove with the back of a butter knife, thick so it wouldn't fall off before the first bite. Raisins pressed in a row on top, small and dark against the pale green. A jar of peanut butter ran about 35 cents in the 1970s. A stalk of celery, pennies. This was not a snack invented by a food company. This was invented by a mother with nothing left in the icebox but the ugly end of a vegetable and a jar half empty. Grandma just called it using what you had. Number 28. Lipton California onion dip 1 foil packet, split open and shaken into a carton of sour cream. Dried onion flecks blooming slowly as it sat, the whole bowl turning faintly gold. Set beside a bag of ruffled chips at every party thrown between 1972 and 1979. 19 cents a packet. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. This was the seam. The exact moment homemade quietly became home assembled. Nobody noticed the difference yet. That was the point. Number 27. Deviled eggs, a dozen eggs, boiled, peeled under cold water so the shells came off clean. Yolks scooped into a bowl and mashed with mayonnaise, a pinch of mustard, paprika dusted on top in a color you could see from across the room. Eggs ran about 60 cents a dozen in the 1970s. Church suppers in the Midwest and potlucks across the rural South were built on this dish, the one thing a family with almost nothing could still bring to a table and not feel small standing next to it. Number 26. Chex Party mix butter melted in a roasting pan. Worcestershire stirred in until the whole kitchen smelled like something was about to matter. Wheat Chex, rice Chex, a handful of nuts, folded in and baked low for half an hour, stirred every 10 minutes so nothing burned at the edges. The recipe first ran in a magazine in 1952, and by the 1970s it belonged to every household that ever made it. This was not a snack you bought in a bag. This was a snack you built, one stir at a time, standing at the oven while it turned gold. Number 25. Rice Krispies Treats the marshmallows went in first, dropped into a pot of melting butter until they lost their shape entirely and turned into something closer to glue than candy, thick, white, pulling long strings off the wooden spoon when you lifted it. The cereal came next, folded in fast before the whole thing set up hard in the pot. Pressed into a pan with the back of a buttered spatula, flattened until it held together but still gave a little under your thumb. Cut into squares once it cooled, and never quite waited long enough before the first one disappeared. They cost next to nothing to make in the 1970s. A box of cereal, a bag of marshmallows, a stick of butter, and you had a dozen bars for less than the price of one candy bar at the corner store. No wrapper, no expiration date printed anywhere. Just a pan on the counter that emptied out over the course of an afternoon, one square at a time, until somebody's mother finally said, "That's enough." Today we call it a gourmet marshmallow bar, and charge $1.50 apiece, individually wrapped, sitting under fluorescent light at a gas station register. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They didn't improve the recipe. They just figured out how to sell you the pan, number 24. Kool-Aid Freezer Popsa, single packet of powdered drink mix, torn open and stirred into a pitcher of water and sugar until it turned the color of something that didn't exist in nature. Cherry red, grape purple, a green that belonged to no fruit anybody had ever seen. Poured into ice cube trays or into paper cups with a toothpick standing straight up in the center and set in the freezer to wait out the afternoon. In working-class Southern households through the 1970s, a single 5-cent packet of Kool-Aid could stretch into a dozen pops, enough to get every kid on the block through the hottest part of the day without spending $1 at the store. There was a waiting involved that nobody minds remembering. Checking the freezer every 20 minutes. The particular sound of a paper cup peeling away from a pop gone solid. Today it's a $6 bag of 6 ice pops at a specialty grocery store, dyed with the same food coloring, sweetened with the same sugar, sold back to us as something new. It was never new. It was a mother stretching a nickel as far as it would go. And it worked every single time. Number 23. Pineapple pecan cheese, Balto blocks of cream cheese. Softened on the counter until they gave easily under a fork. Crushed pineapple folded in, drained hard first so the whole thing wouldn't run. Chopped pecans pressed into the outside by hand, packed in tight until the ball was covered edge to edge. No bare cream cheese showing anywhere. Set in the refrigerator overnight to firm up, then carried into the party on a plate surrounded by a fan of crackers. Cream cheese in the 1970s ran cheap, well under $1 a block, and a can of crushed pineapple cost even less. But nobody at the party knew that. It looked expensive. It looked like something that took money, when really it took an evening and a set of hands willing to press pecans into cold cream cheese until every fingertip went numb. This was not a dip. This was a centerpiece. A woman with almost nothing to spend built something that sat at the middle of the table and made people ask who made this. Can I get the recipe? Grandma just called it dressing up $1's worth of cream cheese. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 22. Peanut butter Buckeyes peanut butter worked into powdered sugar and softened butter with bare hands until the dough turned stiff enough to roll into balls the size of a walnut. Each one speared on a toothpick, dipped 3/4 of the way into melted chocolate. Never all the way, always leaving a small circle of tan peanut butter showing at the top so it looked like the eye of the nut it was named for. This one belongs to Ohio. To the Buckeye trees that gave the state its nickname, and to the kitchens that turned a shelf-stable jar of peanut butter into a candy, nobody else in the country claimed the same way. Made at the kitchen table in the 1970s, a double boiler on the stove behind you, the toothpicks lined up like a small army waiting for their turn in the chocolate. There was no machine that could get that exact ring of tan showing through the chocolate. That took a hand steady enough to stop dipping at exactly the right moment, over and over, 50 times in an afternoon. That is not a small skill. That is muscle memory built from doing something 100 times before you ever got it right, and nobody wrote that down anywhere. It just passed from one set of hands to the next. Number 21. Hot buttered Cheerios, a skillet, low heat, a full stick of butter melted down until it started to turn just barely golden at the edges. A whole box of Cheerios poured in and stirred until every ring was coated, glistening, salted straight from the shaker. 10 minutes on the stove, no oven required, no waiting for anything to cool before the first handful disappeared straight from the pan. There was no sugar in this one, no chocolate, no marshmallow, nothing dressed up to look like a treat. Just a breakfast cereal turned into an afternoon snack with butter and salt and heat, because that was enough. That was always enough. A family in the 1970s didn't need a dessert aisle to make something worth reaching for twice. Number 20. Pigs in a blanket tube of dough popped open on the counter with a sound that meant something good was about to happen. Triangles cut clean with a knife, a hot dog cut into thirds and rolled up tight inside each one, pinched at the seam so it wouldn't come apart in the oven. Lined up on a baking sheet, close enough to touch, brushed with melted butter, baked until the dough turned golden and the smell filled the whole downstairs of the house. This was the dish that showed up at every birthday party thrown in America through the 1970s. Hot dogs ran cheap, a package for well under $1, and a can of crescent dough cost less than a candy bar. But together they became something a child would remember 30 years later without being able to say exactly why. There was a ritual to it. The unrolling of the dough, the careful cutting, the waiting by the oven door. Today we call it artisanal cocktail franks in puff pastry and charge $18 a dozen at a bar with exposed brick walls. Same hot dog, same dough, dressed up in French instead of a can. Grandma just called it pigs in a blanket. She never needed the French. She had something better, a kitchen full of kids who couldn't wait for the timer to go off. Number 19. Benedictine spread a single cucumber, grated fine and squeezed dry in a clean dish towel until every drop of water was wrung out of it, because a wet cucumber would ruin the whole batch. Folded into softened cream cheese with a scraped bit of grated onion. A drop of green food coloring stirred in until the spread took on the pale, cool color of something growing in a garden. Spread thick on white bread, crusts cut off, cut again into triangles small enough to eat in 2 bites. This one belongs to Louisville, Kentucky, and the Ohio Valley around it, a regional dish that a woman named Jenny Benedict popularized decades earlier, and that Kentucky kitchens in the 1970s never let go of. 1 cucumber, 1 block of cream cheese, stretched across an entire party of finger sandwiches, because that was the whole trick of it, making a single vegetable feed a room. Almost nobody outside Kentucky remembers this spread exists. It never made it onto a national menu, never got a marketing budget, never got a jingle. It survived the only way food like this ever survives, passed hand to hand, recipe card to recipe card, because somebody's grandmother refused to let it disappear even after everyone else forgot it was ever there. Number 18. Homemade caramel corn brown sugar and butter melted together in a heavy pot, a pinch of baking soda stirred in at the very end to make the whole mixture foam up pale and light before it hit the popped corn. Poured over a roasting pan full of kernels and folded through with a wooden spoon, every piece coated before it went into a low oven to bake and harden, stirred every 15 minutes so nothing burned to the bottom of the pan. This took the longest of anything on this list, the better part of an hour between the popping and the baking. And it smelled the best of anything on this list, a caramel and butter smell that reached the front porch before the batch was even finished. Farm kitchens and church bake sales across the rural Midwest in the 1970s built entire fundraisers around a pan of this, sold by the bag for $0.25. That is not a small loss. That is a specific loss, the smell of brown sugar foaming in a pot, gone from most kitchens the moment Cracker Jack and shelf-stable caramel corn showed up in the snack aisle, ready in seconds, smelling like nothing at all. Number 17. Deviled ham spread a can of ham, forked apart until it broke down into something closer to paste than meat, mixed with a spoonful of mustard, a spoonful of pickle relish, enough mayonnaise to hold it together without drowning it. Spread thick on a saltine cracker, the ham slightly pink against the white. A little relish juice pooling at the edge if you spread it too generous. A can of deviled ham ran about 25 cents in the 1970s, and a single can, mixed and stretched with pantry staples, could cover 2 full sleeves of crackers. enough for a family to snack through an entire evening without anybody going hungry or anybody spending real money. It sat on the counter in a small bowl with a butter knife standing up in the middle of it, and it disappeared the same way everything on this list disappeared. Fast, and without much conversation. There was nothing fancy about this snack, and nobody pretended otherwise. It was ham from a can, dressed up just enough to taste like somebody cared. That was the whole genius of it, not hiding what it was, just making the most of it. Grandma just called it making do. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 16. Pimento cheese spread sharp cheddar, grated by hand on the small side of the box grater until fingers ached from it. Folded into mayonnaise with a jar of chopped pimentos, drained and stirred through until the whole bowl turned a pale orange, flecked red. Spread on white bread or piled onto a cracker, or eaten straight off the spoon standing at the refrigerator door, which nobody ever admitted to, but everybody did. The South had claimed this one long before the 1970s, but that decade is when it reached its peak in kitchens from Georgia to Texas. Sharp cheddar cost a little more than the mild kind, and a proper Southern cook wouldn't settle for anything less, even on a tight grocery budget. There's a nickname for this dish in the region that's been repeated for generations, the caviar of the South, not because it was expensive, because it was treated like it was, no matter what it actually cost. This was not a snack that needed a recipe card. It lived in memory, in the exact ratio of cheese to mayonnaise that a woman's hands knew without measuring, passed down the same way a family passes down anything worth keeping, by doing it in front of somebody who was paying attention. Number 15. Homemade fruit roll-ups applesauce, or any soft fruit puree on hand. Spread thin across a baking sheet lined with wax paper, thin enough to see the pan through it in places, thick enough to hold together once it dried. Set in a very low oven overnight, the door cracked slightly, until morning brought a sheet of fruit leather, leathery and chewy, pulled free of the wax paper and rolled up tight like a scroll. There was patience required here that no packaged snack ever demanded. A whole night of waiting, an oven left on low while the house slept, and a mother checking on it before bed the way she'd check on a sleeping child. The applesauce cost less than $1 for a jar big enough to cover the whole pan, and the roll-ups that came out of it lasted a week in a jar on the counter, cut into strips with kitchen scissors. Today it's a box of 6 individually wrapped roll-ups for $4. Colored with dye that never touched an actual piece of fruit. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The real thing took longer, and it was better, and it never needed a cartoon on the box to convince a child to eat it. Number 14. Clam dip a can of minced clams, drained but not too dry, folded into softened cream cheese with a dash of Worcestershire sauce and a squeeze of lemon, stirred until the whole bowl turned a pale gray white, with small dark flecks running through it. Set out with a bag of ruffled potato chips, the kind sturdy enough to scoop without snapping. This dip sat at the center of nearly every cocktail party thrown in the 1970s. From coast to coast, a can of clams cost under $1, cream cheese even less, and together they made something that felt like it belonged at a restaurant rather than a living room coffee table. There was a specific sound to this snack, the scrape of a chip through a bowl that was almost empty. The particular request, always near the end of the night, for somebody to bring out more crackers because the dip had outlasted everything meant to hold it. It has nearly vanished from modern tables, replaced by hummus and guacamole and dips that never once involved a can opener. Nobody talks about clam dip anymore, but anybody who grew up in that decade can still describe exactly what bowl it came in. Number 13. Homemade beef jerky round steak sliced thin against the grain, laid flat and rubbed with salt, pepper, and a few drops of liquid smoke standing in for a smokehouse nobody owned. Arranged on the oven racks with the door propped open a crack. left at the lowest possible temperature for most of a day, until the meat turned dark and stiff and chewy, curling slightly at the edges. This belonged to the rural West and to Texas ranch country in the 1970s, where a family raising cattle didn't waste a single cut and drying meat was as practical as it was flavorful. A way to make a cheap piece of round steak last for weeks in a jar on the counter instead of a single dinner. There was no refrigeration required once it was done, no expiration date needed. Just a strip of meat you could carry in a coat pocket to the barn and back. Coal mining towns and cattle country alike understood this same principle from opposite directions. Nothing that could be preserved was ever left to spoil. That is not survival thinking passed down from desperation. That is a kind of intelligence about food that a modern kitchen, stocked with a refrigerator humming in the corner, never had to learn. Number 12. Cheese straw sharp cheddar and butter creamed together with flour and a pinch of cayenne, worked into a stiff dough and pushed through a cookie press fitted with a star tip. Long ribbons of dough laid across a baking sheet in straight lines, cut into 4-inch lengths before they went into the oven. Baked until the edges turned just barely brown, crisp enough to snap clean in half. Southern parlors and church socials in the 1970s served these on silver trays lined with paper doilies. A snack that required a cookie press most families already owned from making Christmas cookies, repurposed here for something savory. There was a particular pride taken in getting the shape exactly right. Straight, uniform, every straw the same length as the one beside it, because a woman's cheese straws said something about her the same way her handwriting did. This was labor most people don't associate with a snack food. An afternoon spent piping dough by hand, one tray at a time, for a plate that would be emptied at a party in 15 minutes flat. Nobody complained about the ratio of work to reward. That was never the point of making it. Number 11. Spiced sugared pecans egg white whipped until it turned foamy and loose, poured over a bowl of raw pecan halves, and tossed until every nut was coated. Sugar and cinnamon sprinkled over the top and folded through, then spread thin across a baking sheet and roasted low and slow. Stirred every 10 minutes so the coating turned crisp instead of burnt, the whole kitchen filling with the smell of warm cinnamon and toasted nuts. Pecan-growing states across the South leaned on this snack heavily through the 1970s. A bushel of pecans from a family tree, or bought cheap by the pound at a roadside stand, transformed into something that could sit in a jar on the counter for weeks, or get wrapped in cellophane and given as a Christmas gift that cost almost nothing but looked like it cost plenty. There was nothing on the label because there was no label. Just a jar, twisted shut, sitting between the flour and the coffee tin. A family didn't need a company's permission or a company's packaging to make something worth giving away. They just needed a pecan tree, an egg, and an oven that ran low, and even number 10. Homemade trail mix raisins, dry roasted peanuts, plain M&Ms, and a scoop of rolled oats, all measured out into a big bowl and tossed together with bare hands until the colors mixed evenly through. No two handfuls ever looked quite the same. Poured into mason jars or old coffee cans with the lids pressed on tight. One for the car, one for the closet, one that somehow always went missing before the trip even started. Hiking and camping culture spread across America through the 1970s, and this snack traveled with it. Cheap bulk ingredients from the grocery store, mixed at home for a fraction of what a packaged trail mix cost, if a packaged version even existed on most shelves yet. A pound of raisins, a pound of peanuts, a small bag of candy. Put together, it fed a family through an entire weekend outdoors. There was no nutrition label needed to know what was in it, because you'd poured every ingredient in yourself. That is a kind of trust in food that has almost entirely disappeared. A jar you filled with your own hands, carrying nothing you couldn't name. Number 9. Peanut brittle sugar and corn syrup boiled together on the stovetop. Watched closely as it climbed toward the hard crack stage. Raw peanuts stirred in near the very end so they wouldn't scorch. A pinch of baking soda folded in fast at the last second, the whole mixture foaming up pale gold before it got poured out thin across a buttered marble slab or a cookie sheet, spreading on its own, cooling into a sheet thin enough to see light through in places. This candy ran through the South, especially in the 1970s, made in big batches around the holidays and broken by hand into jagged pieces once it hardened. No two pieces the same shape. Sugar and corn syrup cost pennies. A bag of raw peanuts cost little more. But the making of it demanded a kind of attention a modern kitchen rarely asks for anymore. Standing at the stove with a candy thermometer, unwilling to look away for even a minute, because a burnt batch meant starting over from nothing. Grandma just called it watching the pot. She was right. Everything she knew was right. You cannot rush sugar, and you cannot rush the things worth making. Number 8. No bake chocolate oatmeal cookie sugar, butter, milk, and cocoa powder brought to a boil on the stovetop for exactly 1 minute, no longer, before a spoonful of peanut butter and vanilla got stirred in off the heat. Rolled oats folded through fast, the whole mixture turning thick and glossy, dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper spread across the counter, left to set at room temperature until they held their shape, no oven required. A detail that mattered more than it sounds, in a Midwest or rural Southern kitchen already running hot from canning vegetables or baking bread, where one more burner going was all a mother could manage on a summer afternoon. 15 minutes from pantry to plate, and a family fed on cookies that cost less than $1 to make an entire batch of. This was efficiency built entirely around care, not convenience. A mother who had exactly 15 minutes and used every one of them well, rather than reaching for something already made. That is not the same thing as a shortcut. That is a woman doing the math on her own time and deciding her children were worth spending it. Number 7. Rocky Road fudge chocolate chips melted slow over a double boiler with a can of sweetened condensed milk, stirred until glossy and thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. Mini marshmallows and chopped walnuts folded in off the heat, quickly, before the marshmallows had time to melt completely into the chocolate. The goal was pockets of soft white and crunchy brown still visible once it set. Poured into a buttered pan and left in the refrigerator overnight. Cut into squares the next morning. Each piece an uneven landscape of chocolate, marshmallow, and nut that never quite matched the piece beside it. This candy showed up at Christmas gatherings across the country through the 1970s. Wrapped in wax paper and given as gifts between neighbors who had known each other 20 years and never once needed to say why they bothered. A can of condensed milk and a bag of chocolate chips cost under $2 combined, and the fudge that came out of it filled an entire pan, enough to give away 8 or 10 small plates and still have some left for the family that made it. Nothing about that math has ever been matched by a candy store. Number 6. Divinity candy egg whites whipped stiff in a bowl, while sugar syrup boiled on the stove, climbing toward the hardball stage, poured in a thin, steady stream into the whipping egg whites without a single pause. Stop too soon or pour too fast, and the whole batch collapsed into a sticky, unusable mess. Beaten until it turned glossy and stiff enough to hold a peak, dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper, where it hardened into something between a marshmallow and a meringue. This candy belonged to Texas, and the Carolinas especially, made most often around the holidays in the 1970s, and it had a reputation in every kitchen that made it, the recipe that separated a confident cook from an anxious one. Humidity could ruin a batch. A pour a half-second too fast could ruin a batch. There was no room for distraction, and every woman who made divinity well had earned that skill through failed batches. Nobody talked about afterward. She was right. Everything she knew was right. down to the exact second she stopped pouring, a kind of precision no recipe card could ever fully capture. Number 5. Party sandwich loafa, full loaf of bread, crusts trimmed and sliced lengthwise into thin layers, spread with 3 separate fillings. Ham salad, egg salad, chicken salad, stacked one on top of the other and pressed back into the shape of a loaf. The whole thing frosted on the outside with a cream cheese and mayonnaise blend, smoothed with a butter knife until it looked, from across the room, exactly like a cake. Women's club luncheons across the country served this dish through the 1970s as the centerpiece of the table, decorated further with sliced olives or pimento arranged on top like piping. It took an entire afternoon to build. 3 separate fillings made from scratch, a loaf carefully sliced without tearing, a frosting spread thin enough to hide every seam. This was theater as much as it was food. A woman turning lunch meat and mayonnaise into something that fooled the eye before it ever reached the mouth. That is not a small trick. That is a kind of showmanship built entirely out of grocery store ingredients, and nobody today would think to attempt it. Number 4. Homemade potato chips, potatoes sliced paper. Then with a mandolin or a steady hand and a sharp knife, soaked briefly in cold water to pull out the starch, patted dry before they hit a pan of hot lard, fried in small batches so the oil temperature never dropped, pulled out the moment the edges turned golden and curled slightly, salted the instant they left the grease while they were still hot enough for the salt to stick. Rural households in the 1970s fried these on the stovetop in cast iron, a few potatoes from the root cellar turned into a whole bowl of chips that cost nothing beyond the oil and the salt. There was a sound to this snack no bagged chip has ever replicated, the hiss of the pan, the crackle settling as they cooled on a paper towel, a sound that meant somebody was standing at the stove for you specifically. That is not progress. Trading that stove and that smell for a foil bag pulled off a shelf. That is a specific and traceable loss, the difference between a chip made for you and a chip made for a warehouse. Number 3. Toasted pumpkin, seeds pulled straight from the stringy center of a carved pumpkin every autumn, rinsed clean in a colander, spread out on a towel to dry before they hit a baking sheet, tossed with a little oil and salt, roasted low until they turned pale gold and started to pop faintly in the oven, filling the kitchen with a smell that meant Halloween had truly arrived. This snack cost nothing. The seeds were already there, discarded by most families before this decade taught households across the country not to waste them. A fall harvest tradition that turned a jack-o'-lantern's leftovers into a bowl that sat on the counter through the entire month of October, eaten a handful at a time while carving pumpkin number 2 or 3. Grandma just called it not throwing away good food. There was a discipline in that phrase that modern kitchens rarely practice anymore, the instinct to look at what most people call trash and ask, first, whether it might still be worth something. It almost always was. She knew that before anybody had to tell her. Number 2. Popcorn popped in bacon grease a coffee can kept by the stove, filled slowly over weeks with the drippings saved from every skillet of bacon fried that month, never thrown down the drain. A spoonful of that grease melted in a heavy pot, kernels added and covered, shaken over the burner until the popping slowed to almost nothing, salt shaken in while it was still hot enough to cling to every piece. Appalachian coalfield households in the 1970s ran their kitchens on this principle without exception. Nothing rendered from an animal ever went to waste, and a can of saved grease meant a family could make popcorn without spending a single additional cent. The smell was smoky, savory, entirely unlike the sweet or buttery popcorn sold in a bag today. It tasted like the whole week that came before it. This was not poverty cooking in the way people mean that phrase now, as something to be pitied. This was precision, a family that understood exactly what every part of an animal was worth, right down to the fat left behind in the pan. That is not deprivation. That is a kind of intelligence a full refrigerator has let most of us forget. Number one, homemade soft pretzel stuff, kneaded by hand until it turned smooth and elastic, rested under a towel until it doubled, then torn into pieces and rolled into long ropes on a floured counter, twisted into the familiar shape, a loop, a cross, folded back on itself, and dropped briefly into a pot of boiling water mixed with baking soda, which gave the crust its deep dark brown color once it hit the oven. Baked until the outside turned glossy and firm, the inside still soft enough to pull apart in warm, doughy strands, a scattering of coarse salt pressed into the top before it ever saw the heat. Pennsylvania, Dutch country built entire family traditions around this snack through the 1970s, passed down through communities where pretzel twisting was taught the same way a language is taught, by doing it beside someone older until your hands learned the shape without thinking about it. Flour, water, yeast, salt. A snack built from almost nothing, transformed by patience and boiling water into something bakeries now charge $6 apiece, for this was the hardest item on this entire list to get right, and it sits at number one because of that. Not the cheapest, not the fastest. The one that asked the most of the person making it and gave back exactly that much in return, closing popcorn balls twisted in wax paper. Buckeyes dipped by hand until the chocolate ring came out even. Soft pretzels boiled, twisted, and baked by women who learned the shape from someone older than them. That is not poor food. That is not a compromise. That was a country that once understood a snack was worth 20 minutes of somebody's full attention. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. This didn't disappear because it was too slow, or too old-fashioned, or too much trouble for a busy family. It disappeared because it was profitable for it to disappear. A packet is easier to sell than a recipe. A bag on a shelf never asks anyone to stand at a stove. Somewhere between 1972 and now, an entire generation of hands stopped shaping, twisting, dipping, and pressing. Not because they lost the skill, but because they were sold the idea that they'd never needed it in the first place. That is not convenience. That is a specific and deliberate loss, engineered one grocery aisle at a time, and it worked on nearly everybody. She was right. Every grandmother who twisted a pretzel or pressed a pecan into cold cream cheese knew something that never made it into a corporate strategy meeting, that food made by hand for people you love tastes like something a factory has never once managed to reproduce, no matter how much they charge for it. Now try one this week. Just one. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.